Hello everyone, welcome to Maverick Citizens Food Justice podcast series called What's Eating Us? My name is Zukiswa Pikoli and I'm a journalist at Maverick Citizen. Programs manager at HEALA Nzama Mbalati, health journalist Laura Lopez and public health lawyer Safura Abdool Karim discuss the impact of big food business on small-scale farming and how the big food industry is targeting low to middle-income countries for the proliferation of ultra-processed foods. So, I think that it's the point that you raise is interesting about building the local economies, because it brings me to the issue of small-scale farming and how small-scale farming is sort of being shrunk out of the piece of the pie because big business is sort of encroaching on their territory. You know, what would you suggest is done around that? And I know it's you can, when you talk about government intervention, we can talk about that till the cows come home. But as long as there's no will to do that, and as long as they're benefiting actually out of those guys sort of coming in and generating the large profits that they are, how do you get around that?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. So any kind of monopoly is a problem. So big farmers produce, they are recognized, they are distributing food to the retail or even importing, like in a small scale, are struggling. So I think one of the things that HEALA has been participating, it's around food governance. So looking at metro and municipality kind of interventions that brings government, private sector, communities and civil society together to craft practical ways, of supporting small-scale farmers, food producers at local level, and ensuring that, these big supermarkets do get food, even if it's in small scale, and purchase food from the local farmers, from the local small-scale farmers. I spoke about procurement. Government provide food in many public sector institutions, hospitals, schools. How do we ensure that the food that is actually coming from small-scale farmers? So I think that voice of small-scale farmers is one of the things that must be mobilized and be organized to actually talk in one voice, but also to be in the mainstream and the forefront of the responding to food. Basically, the food for agriculture it actually give us a situation where we have got food deserts. And by that, I mean, there's a massive production of food, but it's not eaten by people in the community, or it's not available. It goes to the upper market or get imported. So really, small-scale farmers and local food producers are very critical in ensuring that we can have equitable, and we should be very practical in how we advocate and support and make sure that their voice is heard, and that government, private sector, communities as well are held accountable, but also do not look at the local food producers as they're not producing, because that's good food. That's actually mostly healthy food that actually we should be prioritizing and supporting. So when we talk about the economy broadly, we talk about brand South Africa. Right? We need to have brand local producers. We need to have brand small-scale farmer production and purchase. So I believe we need a strong advocacy. We need to support small-scale farmers and local food growers in a much more intentional way in advancing this agenda to filtrate at the political, at social and economic level.
Mm. When you say like supporting small-scale farmers, you also have to think of the argument that says, well, the big business is actually giving people jobs. So now if you're saying that we mustn't be, here, then you're denying people of livelihood.
So that's the thing. And I think it's one narrative which can be argued. So currently, if you look at due to COVID alone, about 2 million jobs were lost, right? And those jobs were mainly lost in the big. So, like, there is a lot of manipulation, and actually, most jobs are actually coming from, small and medium enterprise than big. And then if you look at the big industries, they always restructuring and make sure that they can maximize, and exploit workers, few people doing a lot in order to make profit. So I think that argument it's lost and found, because we can look now if the bigger industries or bigger role players can show to us, this is the numbers in terms of new employment. You'll find mostly, from financial sector across, there isn't evidence that's showing actually workers get retrenched and employment is shrinking in those big industries. So the argument of job losses is because the industry knows that they can hold us by our balls in order to talk about, health policy intervention in terms of protecting the health, of the people, because they know it's a very emotional argument. But in reality, those big sectors and big role players aren't actually creating any more new jobs. It's either a shrinking and restructuring or stay the same.
If you look at our food supply chain, 4 companies control 80% of the food production in South Africa. If you look at the grocery retail market inquiry that just happened, 4 grocery retailers control over 80% of the market when it comes to formal grocery outlets. So really, there is this very close link between the sort of monopolization or concentration of the food supply and choice. Because at the end of the day, what is competition designed to do in a capitalist society? It's designed to create more choice for consumers and ultimately benefit consumers through creating that choice. So where we've got these highly concentrated markets, what we see is that these smaller producers that are offering something that is alternative and different are being crowded out. And we saw that. The Competition Commission's inquiry into the grocery retail sector was absolutely fascinating because it shows you just how this crowding out happens. It doesn't just happen because, this company opened here and another company doesn't want to. In that instance, for example, a Woolworths or a Pick n Pay would go into a shopping mall and say, well, yes, we'll come and buy this space and rent it long term. You're not allowed to have any other grocery stores here. You're not allowed to have any other food retailers here. And that just shows you how that abuse of market share begins to shape things. The same thing applies to the food supply. So a company goes to Pick n Pay and says, yes, we'll supply you with our goods, but you have to display them on this shelf in this way. And you can't put these other products near our products. So when a consumer is going through the grocery aisle and they're looking for items, they're being presented, the deck is being stacked for them to make a particular choice. And really all of these things, if you were able to apply competition law principles and really begin to investigate these things, I believe that's a huge way in which we can begin to transform the formal food sector. The informal sector is a totally different story, and we need to be careful that in doing all of this wonderful activity and regulating all of these different spaces, we're not entering into the problem that Laura described in the US and other high-income countries, because in many ways, those informal vendors are filling that gap that where otherwise these places would be food deserts. They are people's primary source for fresh produce, for other types of groceries. And so it's really, South Africa is an incredibly complicated system where we do have, yes, these dominating features, but also the food supply chain is really run by small independent businesses in the informal sector. So it is incredibly complex. There's no simple answer, unfortunately, to this particular issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Safura is spot on. And again, it's about these systems. And once you sort of start pulling on the thread, then all of these kind of things start to reveal themselves, right? So the way that your geography influences your choice, the way that in the store, even a formal store, your choices influence the way that from farm to plate kind of system is structured, influences your choice. And I think that this is something that, the Human Rights Commission had had, sort of a consultation around like 10 years ago almost, that the fact that, milling in this country for grain is also highly concentrated. So you start to see these kind of power dynamics throughout the system of what we eat quite predominantly.
I want to pick up also on the point about big food sort of infiltrating or targeting low to middle income countries, right? Because now they've saturated the high income countries, and this is sort of the next frontier, so to speak. And the fact that there's been an assertion that South Africa actually is kind of like an entry point into that. So I want to get your comment on why South Africa specifically has been identified as an entry point, but also what has happened in the high income countries that they've now saturated the market and they need a new market.
So I think there's really two things that inform this expansion, and it's not happening in South Africa alone, it's happening actually throughout the region. And these companies are using South Africa as the entry point. It's the gateway to the rest of Africa. And we saw that repeatedly with Pepsi's merger with Pioneer Foods. We saw that with Coca-Cola's expansion into South Africa. It's two things. The one is there is a lack of regulation in Africa in general. Very weak regulatory systems that these companies can exploit. But the other thing is that a lot of these countries are not really prioritizing issues of obesity and overnutrition. They are prioritizing issues of undernutrition and economic growth. So in many instances, countries actually want these companies to expand. They're incentivizing the expansion of these companies. And those two things are a deadly combination, because these companies, which typically have an annual turnover that exceeds the GDP of any given country multiple times over, are then beginning to not only seep into the regulatory environment and begin to shape the regulatory environment, they're also shaping public perception, because they come in and they're, funding basic services that people need, like access to clean water, soccer fields, things like that. And so now all of a sudden the community needs are being met not by the government, but by these corporations. And so when the governments eventually do try and take action against these companies, there's this complicated intertwined relationship that the public has, where the public almost sees these companies as a more legitimate actor than their governments that have been failing them for so long. So it's incredibly complex political environment in Africa. And we've seen the same thing in South America. This is a problem in developing countries or in the middle income context. And it's something that's radically different to what's going on in high income countries.
So you see, countries, the high income countries, where this actually markets, most of these companies are not South African. We have to put it on record. They are multinational companies. When they saturated, when those countries had like highest obese and non-communicable, started to put policies that regulated them. And then they have been like, they saw that there is little space to maneuver, and people are getting more and more aware and informed about their health and knowing what's in their food. So when those market reach stagnates, the next target was the developing, growing populations like ours, like Asia. And South Africa is important for multinationals because it's more like also a link to other countries. So if you do a market, you have a market in South Africa, it works by supply chain. It's easy to connect, but also like South Africa is very cosmopolitan with a lot of people from other countries and non-South African nationals, and that South Africa is a fertile land for that. So they studied that interesting show that, for example, the sugar sweetened beverages targeted people who are earning 3,500 in this country. So majority of this population in South Africa is youth, low earners to unemployment. And that's where, when you come with cheap products to drink or to eat, it's easy to make money because you're producing things that doesn't cost you anything, that has no nutritional value, but can be given to people because people will want to feel. Whether it's nutritious or not. So I think that's the multinational studied our behavior, our needs, and they pitch a product precisely where they're gonna get us hooked. And I think the sugar industry, the food industry understand this research that shown like there have been a significant growth in the building of KFC in the township, like the study was done in Soweto. And that because they knew like people are working, like what Eunice has said, people are working, they arrive. So it's convenience to have a drive-through, to just walk and buy what's cheap. And fill your stomach and sleep and see another day. And because non-communicable diseases, they grow and build up over time, it's easy to ignore what can be a long-term, short, medium-term consequence compared to I have to deal with hunger today.
We definitely see that Africa, because it's an emerging market, is definitely a key target demographic for food companies wanting to push this kind of food into markets. So you see this all over the world. You see it in the US as well, brown and black people being targeted with this kind of food because the income brackets that they're in. And also that they're sort of seen as this emerging market where companies can still make a sort of more gains in terms of the numbers of people they're hitting. And I think, we really need to figure out, also if you look at that, brown black people, historically disadvantaged, have worse access to healthcare. So when people who are poor get sick, you also have like a harder, you can't just go to the hospital and get a bunch of testing strips to be able to control your diabetes really well, because I think the last time I checked in the government, I think you got like 2 testing strips a day, which again, living with a type 1 diabetic, like would not fly in my household. Like my family member would not be able to survive on that. So I think, again, you're like looking at multiple layers of disadvantaged kind of access to health and then healthy foods and how that plays out. And so I think we really need to like start having more mainstream conversations about how systems are designed to target people who are already very vulnerable.
That brings us to the end of our food justice podcast series called What's Eating Us? My name is Zukiswa Pikoli and I'm a journalist at Maverick Citizen. Thank you for tuning in.